どうもありがとうございました。それでは最初の講演に参りましょう。Techstars CFO デイビッド・コーヘンさんにご登壇いただきます。テーマは GiveFirst。講演の後にはライブでの Q&A セッションもございます。Zoom チャットにて質問をお寄せいただければ幸いです。それでは皆様どうぞお楽しみください。
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me at the event today. It's really exciting to be partnered with JETRO and be working on so many exciting things in Japan. My name is David Cohen. I'm one of the co-founders of Techstars. So about 15 years ago, we created Techstars as what you've heard by now as the worldwide network that helps entrepreneurs succeed. And I want to talk today about the principle or the idea of give first. We think this is one of the secrets of Techstars, and it's a way that we really help entrepreneurs succeed across our global network. So what is this idea of give first? It's simply the idea of helping others, especially entrepreneurs, without any specific expectation of getting something back. In other words, it's not transactional. I want to help because you're an entrepreneur or you're someone that needs help, and I don't expect to get anything back in return. When we first started Techstars in 2006, we used to say, give before you get. It's a similar idea, one where you haven't gotten something, but you're just willing to give, to be helpful. And over time, we realized that we should call this give first, especially as social media like Twitter emerged and we needed a hashtag for it. But I have a co-founder at Techstars named Brad Feld, who's still involved today. Brad is a terrific venture capitalist and prolific author. One of the books he wrote is called Startup Communities, and it's from 2012, I believe, about how great startup communities are built. And that's really where Brad first defined this idea of give first, which means you're willing to put energy into a relationship or a system without defining the transactional parameters. However, it's not altruism because you do expect to get something back. You just don't know when or from whom, what form it's going to take or in what consideration or over what time frame you might get something back. But you have an expectation that by being helpful, by giving first, you will in fact get some benefit yourself someday. Now, this is particularly impactful in the context of networks and startup communities, like many of us are interested in, especially with work we might be doing in corporations to engage with startups. It's a very specific idea that can be very impactful. In the early days of Techstars, when we were recruiting mentors, for example, and today we have some 7,000 mentors that work with Techstars around the world, we explained to them that if you give first, you'll get something back. But we also didn't know what that would be. And today, if you talk to those mentors, they'll all tell you that they've gotten something unexpected back from the network. At that time, it wasn't clear what the word mentor really meant. The term advisor was heavily used, and actually the difference between mentor and advisor illustrates the idea of give first. A mentor doesn't charge anything, where an advisor, in our definition, wants some stock or some cash in order to be helpful to startups. But a mentor is willing to give first. So that's why we call them mentors, and we wanted to differentiate them from advisors. Everyone who mentors around Techstars, these 7,000 mentors, none of them get paid for it. So why do they do it? Because they have some expectation of getting something back in some other way. That might be a job someday in one of the startups that's growing. And I'll tell you a few stories like that. It might be an investment they get to make. It might just be that their community gets better and those startups grow and give back to the community in other ways. But the key point is that this idea of give first is very important as a social norm for the most successful startup communities in the world. So give first and helping others be successful without any expectation of getting something back in a transaction is not about keeping score. It's quite the opposite. You have no idea how it will help you, but you have confidence that it will help you or things you care about in the future. Now, I want to compare this to the idea of pay it forward, which many of you may have heard as a term, meaning someone helped me in my career and I want to help someone else to pay it forward for that person who helped me when I was earlier in my career. It's a similar idea, but I want to point out that it's also pretty different. It's different because you don't need to wait until someone does something for you to give it forward. In fact, the most successful startup communities in the world don't have a lot of this dynamic going on initially, and they determine that they need to start the trend. So you need to be first to give first if no one has given to you. You don't need to wait until someone does something nice for you to be helpful to an entrepreneur or someone else in your community. And I think that the most successful startup communities really think this way. And so if you're trying to get a startup community to build and grow, or you're trying to build a network around your corporation that involves startups, the most impactful thing you can do is to go first, is to just be helpful and don't make it about a deal, don't make it about a transaction. And you'll find that it's very, very powerful how that will come back to you in unexpected ways. So there are also 7,000 alumni around Techstars, as you may know, people that have been through our accelerator programs. In fact, we just crossed the point where we have more alumni that have been through the programs than we have mentors. And that's super powerful in the context of a network like that, because they buy each other's products, they make intros for each other. They're willing to give first because so many gave first to them. So by starting to give first, you create this pay it forward mentality. And give first is a great thing to talk about around any community that you're trying to build, or you're trying to create opportunities in a future together with a network. So a few stories of how this works in real life. We have a company called SendGrid that is in our portfolio. I served on the board from the time it was born until the time it went public, which took about 9 years. And very early on, they had a mentality that they adopted that's very similar to Give First. If you called SendGrid or you emailed SendGrid about a problem you were having with email, any kind of email problem, they were a transactional email provider. So, they would send email for applications to make sure those emails got delivered. This infrastructure that at one point was sending about 2% of the world's legitimate email through the SendGrid servers. They're now part of Twilio. They went public, and then Twilio, another public company, bought them. But early on, they believed that if they gave first, meaning they would answer any phone call they got from anyone with an email problem, that it would come back to them in unexpected ways. I'm not talking about their customers. I'm talking about anyone who had a problem with email. They didn't know how to use Outlook, or they didn't know how to use a protocol to create programming around email. The SendGrid people would talk to them and walk them through it with no expectation of getting anything back. And it turned out that this is how they got a lot of their early customers. Those customers said, wow, these people are really great with email, and we ought to look at their product, and they started to buy their product. And a lot of their early customers that got the company going were just people who saw them as experts on email and wanted to ask them a question, who ended up being customers. But oftentimes that was a year or two later. It wasn't right away. Another story around this company, SendGrid, is they had a mentor who was giving first to them named Jim Franklin. And Jim was a mentor in the Techstars Accelerator program and was just providing lots of free input, lots of free advice. That continued after they graduated from the Techstars Accelerator. And many years later, when SendGrid went to look for a new CEO, they already knew Jim. And Jim had a lot of experience as a CEO and had been in big companies like Oracle, understood these type of infrastructure products. And Jim then became CEO quite naturally because he had been around the company for so long. But he never had the idea that he would do that. He never had the expectation that that's where it would end up, but it came back to him in a very powerful way. He gave first, and he ended up being a CEO at SendGrid, which ultimately was a public company and very financially successful. But he never had that in mind. In fact, he was helping 6 or 8 other companies, right, by giving first. And that came back to him in a very powerful way. Today, SendGrid is still all about give first. So is Twilio as part of that larger company. They give their product to free for all of the companies in the Techstars network. It's some of our millions of dollars of perks that every startup we fund gets because of this give first idea. So if we're funding companies with, a small amount of capital, $120,000, they're getting $2 million in free products like this from companies that give first, including SendGrid and Google and Apple and Microsoft and many others. So it's really embedded in what they do as part of their culture, and it's been very, very powerful for them. I'll tell you another quick story of a company you may have heard of called Apple. It used to be called Apple Computer, but it's called Apple. You may or may not know that in the early days of Apple, they gave computers to schools. And that's been portrayed today as a brilliant marketing move to give away their computers, the Apple computers, to schools. Kids get their first experiences with Apple computers, not with the competitors to Apple, right? IBM and others at that time. And really, Apple was doing that as a way to kind of have some, corporate social responsibility. And I'm sure someone thought, well, that's a good idea too for marketing, but they didn't know. They didn't know that that would work. So they gave a lot of hardware to a lot of schools, and they said, we just want to be helpful and give. And of course, that led to one of the most valuable companies on the planet today. It led to Apple computers being dominant in that generation that grew up using them in schools because they were a better product and they got to experience them. So that was a big gamble on Give First that really worked for a big company. I'll tell you another one, another company you may have heard of called Microsoft. They worked with SendGrid and many other companies in our network. They give first to Techstars free hosting, free tooling. And just to tie it back to the earlier story, SendGrid was a company that Microsoft helped out, but then SendGrid used Azure as their early distribution. Azure is the Microsoft platform for cloud computing. And there was a partnership there that was very lucrative to both companies and gave Azure a sort of head start in the cloud computing space by having this new solution that so many startups wanted. So again, Microsoft gave first to a startup, and that startup gave back by working with them early to deliver their product to the market and share revenues and other things. But it was never a deal. It was something that evolved because of the spirit of Give First. And lastly, I'll tell you about a story that is one of my favorite startups here in Boulder, Colorado, where I live in the US, called JumpCloud. Rajat Bhargava, who's a friend of mine, he uses a model called freemium to give away his software for free. And that's obviously a well-established way of giving away software to small companies who then grow to be big companies. But he's seen that really work for him at JumpCloud. That company has grown. It's a very, very valuable unicorn company now. And just the whole idea of freemium is an example of give first that corporations can do. But the more you give to the smaller companies, the more they remember it as they grow, right? And so I'll just wrap it up by saying, and I think we'll do some Q&A around this. The secret weapon of any great community, whether that's a startup community or a corporate network around startups, is give first. It's not the question of what's in it for me now, but rather it's a belief that if you give, and the more you give and the more helpful you are to these early entrepreneurial companies, particularly these startups that we're all talking about, very powerful things can happen in your network and in the future. Now, Brad Feld and I have a podcast on this. I'd encourage you to check it out. It's at givefirst.techstars.com. We interview entrepreneurs and leaders about how Give First works in practice. So I'd encourage you to check it out to learn more about the idea behind Give First. I hope you have a great rest of the event, and I look forward to doing a little question and answer period.
それでは Q&A セッションに移らせていただきます。モデレーターは ジェトロのサンフランシスコ事務所において、Techstarsとのパートナーシップを推進してきた現イノベーション促進課課長の樽谷が務めます。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
Hello? Can you hear me?
こんにちは。聞こえますでしょうか。
Hi, David. Can you hear me okay?
デイビッドさん、こんにちは。聞こえていますか？はい、聞こえてますよ。本日はご参加いただき誠にありがとうございます。こちらこそありがとうございます。
質問を始めさせていただきたいと思います。デイビッド、英語で聞こえてますか？それでは一つ目の質問ですけど、GiveFirstの精神でスタートアップをサポートするとき、その見返りまでの間と自分の時間、エネルギーをどうやって割いていくかということ、何かヒントありますかということです。例えばね、すべてのスタートアップにサポートできるわけではないと思うんですけど、どうやって自分のこの時間とエネルギーを割いていくかというところが最初の質問になります。
Great.
はい、ご質問いただきありがとうございます。そうですね。もちろん、バランスを取らなくてはいけないとあるかと思います。GiveFirstをどの程度やるのかというところと、売上をどのくらい出すのかというところはバランスを取る必要があるというのはその通りで、それを間違った選択肢を取ってはいけないということですね。GiveFirstをすることによって、もちろん売上は長期的にはプラスになるというところはあるというところが重要なところだと思います。なので、クリエイティブになる必要があるかと思うんです。つまり、例えばマイクロソフトでしたり、他の企業やセンドグリッドなどがやってきたことは、まず、パッケージをオファーするということですね。それは繰り返し使ってもらえるということです。スタートアップと起こって繰り返し使ってもらえるということで、1万ものスタートアップと繰り返し関わる必要があるというわけではちょっとないんですね。まずはじめにGiveFirstとしてプロダクトを提供して、そこから始まっていくということです。最初はフリーかもしれませんけれども、本日の時点では、例えば、今の段階で売りがかなり増えていると思うんですね。それはそういった小さいレベルの企業が将来的にはかなり大きな規模の企業になるかもしれないということがあるからです。そうすると将来的にはプロダクトから得られる利益が増えていくだろうと思います。その企業が他にも口コミで広げてくれるということもあるでしょう。そういった形で大きな企業が成功を収めているというところがあると思います。それから1対1の企業間でのやり取りとしてももちろんバランスは取らなくてはなりませんね。私たちやらなくてはならない仕事もあると思いますから。ですので、例えば1時間、数時間時間を取って、このGiveFirstに関して時間をかけると決めるというのもいいかもしれません。長期的にはそういったことプラスになるかと思いますので、自分が何をしなくてはならないかというところと、スタートアップどのように手助けをすればいいのかというところを考える必要があるかと思います。長期的にはかなりそれがプラスの結果になるだろうと思います。
もう一つ質問いただいてます。今日大企業の方がいっぱい来られてるんですけど、オープンイノベーションにおいて大企業とかの組織にですね、GiveFirstの精神を理解してもらうにはどのようにしたらいいんでしょうかという質問です。
Well, I think what I've
はい、あ
seen
りがとう
is
ございます。そうですね。私の経験に基づくと、企業が、他の企業に対してロールモデルになるという必要があるということです。自分が成功するにあたって、例えば私自身もセンドクリットだったり、トリリオだったり、マイクロソフト、アップルの例をお話をしてきましたよね。これは成功を収めてきた企業なわけです。GiveFirstの精神に基づいて成功してきたわけです。なので、私としてはこれを社会的規範にしていくということですね。具体的には、これが私たちが期待することなんだ。コミュニティではこういったことが期待されるということを広げていくことが重要だと思います。そうすると、私たちの社会に参画している方が GiveFirst の精神を当たり前のものだと思うようになると思うんですね。例えば大企業があっても、そのコミュニティの中にいれば GiveFirst をしないとそのコミュニティの一員ではないようになりますよね。ですから、そういった大企業の方々もコミュニティの中で GiveFirst が当たり前のことだなと思ってもらうこと、そしてそれに基づいて動いてもらうことが重要だと思うんです。このGiveFirst の精神の方、自分たちでやっていくということが重要ですね。自分たちが成功を収めていく中で、こういったやり方で、人々が振る舞っていくべきなんだということを広めていくことが重要であろうと思います。
少しいっぱい聞きたいところなんですけど、今回 Q&A の質問が5分ということで、デイビッドさん、後でですね、皆さんからメール等で質問があると思いますので、引き続きよろしくお願いいたします。今日はありがとうございました。
Thank you all.
ありがとうございました。
デイビッド・コーヘンさん、ありがとうございました。